So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk now for about 30 or 35 minutes or so. And what I might do is just start by introducing the theme of the next, I believe, 6 talks. The talks are from something called the Vimilakirti Nirdesha. And the Vimilakirti Nirdesha is one of the sort of central or the more famous texts from the Mahayana. Yeah? So Buddhism is often said to be divided into 3 sort of yanas or ways. And they are the Hinayana, the little way, the Mahayana, the great way, or then the Vajrayana. So the Hinayana, and I wouldn't take these terms too literally, meaning the little way, it's a slightly pejorative way. Certainly nobody from the Hinayana would refer themselves as that. But as one of these ways of separating these sort of movements in Buddhism. So it goes right back to the time of the Buddha. Yeah, it's the Theravada essentially. And it very much focuses on the written word of the Buddha. Tends to be quite formulaic. Often tends to be quite list-oriented, and is very much focused on, the 4 Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the 3 Lakshanas, the 4 Requisites, all of the sort of the real kind of bones of the spiritual life. Yeah, so that's the Theravada, the Hinayana. That comes quite directly from the Buddha's word. Yeah, all those 2,500 years ago, very much focuses on the Buddha's word, the historical Buddha's word, I should say. And then you have this movement flower about 500 years after the Buddha's death, which has eventually come to be called the Mahayana. And the Mahayana, the Great Way, the central sort of myth or idea around it was that what the Buddha did, which was to rediscover the way to enlightenment in this sort of cosmic vision of Buddhism, in this great cosmic vision of Buddhism, the Buddha was said to have rediscovered the way to enlightenment. Yeah, so when the Dharma dies out, the way to enlightenment, the path to enlightenment dies out. Traditionally, in Buddhist doctrine, a Buddha comes into the world. Yeah, a Buddha comes into the world and rediscovers that way to enlightenment. And the historical Buddha was said to have done this, rediscovered the way to enlightenment underneath the Bodhi tree some 2,500 years ago in what is now India, a place in Bihar called Bodh Gaya. And what the Mahayana came along and did was and said that all living beings could aspire to what the Buddha did. Yeah? So what initially came out of the Buddha's discovery of enlightenment, the schools that developed and the traditions that developed out of that, said that basically what our job was to do was to attain enlightenment for ourselves even. It's not quite as simple as that. It's not quite as simple. That's a bit simplistic. But to attain enlightenment, just like the Buddha did, by following the Buddha's example for ourselves. Yeah, that was all we could do, essentially. Now, what the Mahayana did some 500 years later, and it could have been a response to all sorts of historical factors and cultural factors that were happening at the time, was say, no, all human beings could aim to do what the Buddha did, which was to rediscover enlightenment and practice, not just for the sake of themselves, for the sake of all living beings, but for the sake of all living beings. Yeah. So from that arises this really amazing myth of the Bodhisattva, right, where the Bodhisattva forgoes enlightenment for themselves, stays within the world, stays within nirvana, stays within samsara, forgoes nirvana, so that they can help all living beings out of samsara, which is the world that we live in, this side of enlightenment, and into nirvana. So gains enlightenment for all living beings. And that's what the Mahayana basically encourages human beings to do, the bodhisattva ideal, the ideal that we practice altruistically, that we emphasize the altruistic element of the spiritual life, which is that not only are we doing it to take ourselves out of suffering, but that also that we can help others do it around us as well. That we help others along the path. Yeah, so this is the Vimilakirti Nirdesha, comes from this myth of delivering all living beings from suffering and into enlightenment, into nirvana, just like the Buddha looked to do. Yeah? So it's full of myth and colour and magic. Yeah, the Vimilakirti Nirdesha, as the Mahayana is in general, full of colour and myth and poetry. Yeah, so Vimilakirti is said to appear to all beings as they appear themselves. Yeah, so he goes into the brothels to teach amongst the brothels. Yeah, he goes to the casinos and appears as a gambler to speak to the gamblers. Yeah, he goes into the drinking dens and appears as one of the people there to preach, to practice amongst the people in that particular world. Yeah, so he goes out to people and he appears in their own image. Yeah. So that's what Vimilakirti, the Vimilakirti Nirdesha, this sutra opens out with. Yeah, it's Vimilakirti going to all these different places to connect with people in the various sort of situations that they are. Yeah. And in his doing that, he gets into all sorts of tangles. Yeah, so he goes out to the arahats. So the arahats are the enlightened disciples of the Theravada, and of course, in the Mahayana's view, they've only achieved a lesser enlightenment. And again, we need to take all of this with a little pinch of salt. But they've only achieved a lesser enlightenment, which is enlightenment for themselves. Yeah. And what Vimilakirti is asking them to do he's basically saying, no, you've not achieved full and perfect enlightenment. There's more for you to learn. And he challenges them on the basis of all of their assumed beliefs, their uncritical thinking, their ideas about themselves as to what they've achieved and what's possible. Vimilakirti goes out and he challenges them. Yeah. And he says, no, you haven't achieved everything that there is to be achieved. There's actually more. You can do more. And of course, he gets into all of these tangles. And the Buddha in this grand mythic sutra is there with the arahats, and he's saying, from his historical disciples, Shariputra, will you go and speak with Vimilakirti? And Shariputra says, I will not go and speak with Vimilakirti. Vimilakirti got me into all sorts of knots. Last time that I spoke with him, he challenged me in ways that I couldn't handle, and he says it to Moggallana, and Moggallana is in the same position. He doesn't want to go and speak to Vimilakirti. So Vimilakirti is creating all sorts of waves in this particular sutra. Yeah? He's really kind of shaking things up, shaking people out of their sort of complacency in a lot of ways, and saying, look, there's more. There's more there. There's not just enlightenment for ourselves. There's enlightenment for all living beings. So what Vimilakirti basically does is he challenges the arahats' horizons. Yeah, the Buddha's sort of historically enlightened disciples. He challenges their horizons. He says there's more. He gets them to look higher in a sense. And this is what the Mahayana, the Vimilakirti Nirdesha, Vimilakirti himself, no doubt, is getting us to do. He's asking us to do this similarly ourselves. He's saying, well, what are your horizons? Are they too low? Do they need to be higher? Yeah? Can we look higher? Can we want more for ourselves, or can we stretch ourselves more? Can we demand more of ourselves? This is what Vimilakirti is saying. This is what the Mahayana is saying to us. Could, in fact, we stretch ourselves to the highest vision possible, which is not just to attain enlightenment, as difficult as that would be, as many lifetimes as that could take. could you attain enlightenment not just for yourself but for all living beings? And of course the Mahayana deals in these huge timescales, aeons and aeons and aeons. How long this would take to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all living beings. It's said to take endless kalpas. And a kalpa is where you get how a kalpa is measured is you get a mountain, a rock, 100 miles high and 100 miles wide. And every 100 years somebody comes along and they sweep over it a piece of Benares silk. Benares silk, a very, very delicate silk. And in the time that it would take to erode away the whole mountain with this effect, that's a kalpa. So we're talking a long time. Yeah? So the Mahayana is saying, can you do that? Can you look at that horizon, the highest possible horizon for your practice? Yeah? And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that whole thing of horizons in our Dharma life, in our lives ourselves, our Dharma life, our life in general. It's very, very interesting about horizons, isn't it? Somebody was telling me that not that long ago that apparently horizons are very, very important to human beings. Apparently our mental health improves quite a bit by just having a physical horizon that we can see. Yeah. So in London, we don't often see a physical horizon, do we? We're in an urban centre and we can't often see that far ahead. Well, apparently that in itself has an effect on our mental states. Yeah, I was down with a friend in Eastbourne just on last weekend, and we were going for a walk along the Seven Sisters, these beautiful chalk cliffs that run from Eastbourne out along the South Downs. Amazing, you can see these amazing horizons right out, and the play of light and beauty and wind, and you're right in there amongst nature. And it's interesting what the nature of even physical geographical horizons can do. It opens out our perspective. We can see further. They're symbolic. Geographical horizons, I think, are symbolic of mythic horizons or mental horizons as well. It expands our world out when we can see them. So they're very, very important, I think. And one of the reasons I think we should get out of the city as much as we possibly can. And difficult as that all might be actually in the next little while and during lockdown, but get out into nature and see horizons. But we can ask ourselves, what are the horizons of our life? Yeah, what are the horizons of our life? And one of the important things about that is, well, what is the context that we see our life in? Of course, what Vimilakirti is saying is he wants us to see the context of our life in the broadest possible means, yeah, whereby our life is not just an aspect of what we do in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, however it might be, but actually takes part in a much broader aspect or a much broader myth that goes on for aeons and aeons and aeons and aeons. Yeah, he wants us to see our lives in the broadest possible horizons. Because it's very, very important on, I think, how we behave and how we act, how we see our horizons. So we can ask ourselves, well, what do we see the horizons of our lives? Do we see the horizon of our life as starting when we were born and then ending when we die? Yeah, and just being oblivion either side. That will, of course, affect how we act, because our views affect how we act so much. If we think that our life just begins when we're born and ends when we die, which would not be the Buddha's way of viewing of things. The Buddha felt that something happened, that consciousness continued in some way after we died and was handed on, passed on in some way after we died. If we see our life actually as just being oblivion, as ending after we die, very, very common view now, scientific materialist view of the world and our lives, how does that affect our lives? Do our lives then become, say, a smash and grab on pleasure, or a smash and grab on status, or however long, 80 years if we're lucky, of the game well played? Yeah. how do we see our lives? How we see our lives in that way will affect the way that we go about our lives and the vision that we have for our lives and the horizons that we have for our lives. So what are our horizons? Yeah, we can ask ourselves that. Now, of course, I'm not saying to anybody that you have to believe in a Buddhist idea of what life is and how it starts and where it ends. But you can just ask yourself, well, what is it you think? And do you think that has an effect on your outlook on life and how you behave? So what are our horizons for ourselves? And I think also, not also just what are the horizons for our lives, but what are the horizons for ourselves? Yeah? Do we think that say, for example, that we can't change very much? Yeah, so what the Mahayana is asking for us is to start to tread a path that leads to the very pinnacle of human experience. Yeah, the perfection of all human virtues, of all human values, a radical sense of love for those around us, a radical sense of going forth from the world, of going forth from status, of going forth from hate and from craving. That's what the Mahayana is saying can be done if we tread this particular path, if we tread the path of Vimilakirti. Yeah? The Mahayana is saying we can do that. So what are the horizons that we set for our lives in that extent? Do we even really think that's possible? I mean, I think for myself, I wonder, do I really think that's possible? What's really my attitude in that way? How do I see the limits of me as a person? And do I set limits on myself by the views of what I think I can or cannot do? Yeah, do I think, I'll always just be a bit grumpy? That's just me. Yeah, I'll always just be a bit too introverted. That's just me. What are the things that we think can't really change? And is it true that they can't change? My experience of meditation in the Dharma life is that you can really achieve radical change in your life. Why would we set horizons on that? Yeah, why would we set limits on that? Why couldn't we set horizons that are much broader? Yeah, that really, really look up, that really look to something of the transcendent or the divine. So in some ways, when we set limits on ourselves, we imprison ourselves in that way. We imprison ourselves in a prison that can feel very comfortable. Yeah, as much as it might be distressing at times, in the sense of we've got all these negative mental states that are problematic for us, and we've got all sorts of problems. We stay comfortable within that particular prison, within that box. Yeah. And the arahats in the Vimilakirti Nirdesha, these enlightened disciples, who have achieved a lesser enlightenment as far as Vimilakirti has achieved enlightenment just for themselves. The arahats, according to Vimilakirti, have got too comfortable. Yeah, they've put themselves into a particular prison in which they're still restricted. Yeah, in which they're still limited. They still haven't achieved all there is to be achieved from a human life. Yeah. They've got too comfortable, and of course we can get very comfortable with who we are as well, even though of course my grumpiness can causes me problems all the time. I can be comfortable with it. I can just get comfortable with it, because looking to challenge that or to break down those limits are uncomfortable. Yeah, change can be uncomfortable. It can be very, very uncomfortable. In fact, it can be very intense. Of course, medicine in that regard is always worth taking, has been my experience. The practice of meditation, of ethics, of wisdom, though it's uncomfortable and though it brings me up against myself quite a lot sometimes, it's always worthwhile. It's always beneficial. So sometimes I get too comfortable and I don't want to challenge myself anymore. I want a little bit of a rest. I want to take it easy. And of course, the person I cheat myself mostly, who I'm cheating mostly with that attitude, is me. But we can get very, very comfortable with our sort of middle of the road mental states. And I remember this being made very clear to me actually once. I was on solitary. It was my first big solitary, my 2-week solitary. And I was in a place called Vimilakirti in Spain. It was some years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago now. And so a solitary retreat is basically where you go off by yourself for 2 weeks. You leave your phone behind, you leave your laptop behind, you have no contact with the outside world, you don't see anybody else, you don't speak with anybody else. So it's just you in solitude for a certain period of time. You meditate, you study, you reflect. And I was doing this 2-week solitary in Spain, and it was very, very interesting, a very, very intense 2 weeks. And I remember what would happen was my experience in those 2 weeks would go from being intensely painful for 24 hours, intensely sort of despondent and despairing for 24 hours, to intensely, I would even say, agonizingly happy for 24 hours. Yeah, it was unbearably happy, right? I sat there going, if only I could be a little less happy, this would be comfortable, it would be fine. But it was just as uncomfortable as the despair. Yeah, it was just as intense as the despair. I was way too happy, right? And it was just the uncomfortableness of a different way of being, of a more open way of being, of a broader horizon, of the absence of the comfortable, mucky ways that I muddy my mind every single day. It was just the absence of those things, because of course those things are familiar. They were familiar to me. And of course what's unfamiliar is frightening, isn't it? It's uncomfortable. Irrespective of how pleasant it might feel, of how open it is, it's uncomfortable. And so I really got an insight to that in this particular solitary. It was like, oh my God, I didn't think happiness could be so unbearable. And that's what it was. It was an unbearable happiness, and I would have done anything. And of course, was I here, had I been at home in London at the time, I just would have blunted it. Yeah, if I get into those sort of open, happy mental states, I would have done something to muddy it. Oh, I don't know. I would have gone on to YouTube and watched endless dog videos, or I would have gone for a pint, or drank too much coffee, or ate too much food, something like that. I would have done anything to take the edge off that happiness. And of course, that's putting myself back into that prison. So I've been, in Spain, experiencing all these open mental states, all this liberation, and I'm knocking on the door back into the prison. Right, I want back in on my limitations. So the Vimilakirti is saying we're imprisoned and we don't even know it. And sometimes we're very, very comfortable in that prison and we don't even want to step out. And he's saying that to the arahants. Yeah, he's saying that to those who are enlightened already. So if that's true of the arahants, how much more is it going to be true of ourselves, of course? Very, very much so, isn't it? It's going to be very, very true of ourselves. So we don't know we're in a prison, and partly because the myth of our life and the visions of our life are too small often. This relates back to the horizons that we set in ourselves, the horizons that we set on our lives. If our lives just start at birth and end at death, our horizons will be small, and we won't know that we're in a particular prison of, well, whatever the view that comes out of that way of seeing our life. Our horizons are small, so we won't see the potential for more. We won't see, for example, the potential of the Buddha. And so we'll sort of stay in a prison and we won't even know we're in it. So what Vimilakirti wants to do is to emancipate the Arahants. Yeah, he wants to emancipate alongside the Mahayana. He wants to liberate all living beings. Yeah, and this is very much the vision of the Buddha's Dharma. You know, of the Mahayana, of the Theravada, of Tibetan Buddhism. It's freedom. It's liberation. Yeah, freedom from everything that holds us back, all limitations. Freedom from all hate, from all craving. On an unimaginable state to human beings. Yeah, we couldn't even imagine it. An inconceivable liberation. Yeah. And so that's what we should see. Yeah, when we see an image of the Buddha, what we should see is an image of liberation. Yeah, when we think of enlightenment, we should think of liberation, freedom. Yeah. As I said, freedom beyond all limits, all our limits, in whatever way they may be. And of course, freedom is inconceivable. We don't know it, and you never really know what it is that imprisons you until you get out of it, don't you? I mean, that's one of the things. It's actually because our prisons, our mental prisons, are the world around us. They're our total experience, and of course, we don't know what that is until we've expanded beyond it. You could imagine, say, for example, I remember this movie called The Room years and years and years back. It was a movie, and basically the idea of it was this woman had been captured and put into a sort of like a shed and imprisoned in this shed, and her capturer, she'd had a child by her capturer in the meantime, and this child had grown up in this room. So the room was the four walls, the world was these four walls to the child. Yeah, he didn't know of anything beyond room. Yeah, and so the mum in this particular movie would try and explain what it was beyond room, but he had no idea what that could possibly be. Yeah. We're in a similar state because we, of course, we're not in that extreme sort of situation, but we're in a state where the four walls of the room are our minds. Yeah, and it's very, very cramped. It's particularly cramped in terms of what the Buddha's vision for what the world is, yeah, for what reality is. We create four walls, we create this prison with our mind, and of course we can't see the prison because it's our total experience. Yeah, we could only see the prison if we stepped out of it. And very, very hard to do that, yeah, until we've actually done it. So we don't know what it is, and commitment to the Buddha's enlightenment, commitment to the Buddha's path is, of course, in that extent, a commitment to the unknown. Yeah, we don't know what it is we're committing to. We take it on a sense of faith in that regard. We might see people, or we might meet somebody who we think, God, they've really got something to them. Yeah, that was really my strong thing of effect of first coming across the Dublin Buddhist Centre 10 years ago or so. I met some of the people who have gone on to be very good friends, order members who have been practicing the Dharma for a long time. And I thought these people have really something to them. I wonder what that is. So that's where we start to get the visions of what it is we commit to in the Dharma life. But we really do commit to something that's unknowable to us, is inconceivable to us. And of course, we don't know what that is, yeah? We don't know what that is, so sometimes we don't want to commit to it because it's unknown. It's very, very interesting. Maitreya Bandhu, you might have seen it, Maitreya Bandhu and Yanavacha have been, there was a set of interviews with Ian McGilchrist a couple of weeks ago. I'd really encourage you to go and look at those lectures, or those interviews if you haven't seen them. Really, really excellent. And go and read Dr. McGilchrist's book. It's called The Master and His Emissary, really good. And his whole thesis is that what he talks about is the two hemispheres of the brain and what they tend to specialize in. And the left hemisphere specializes in what's known, yeah, and the right hemisphere looks out towards what's not known, yeah. And what Dr. McGilchrist believed was that we've become particularly left hemisphered in our particular cultural circumstances. We've become particularly prone to certainty, and we don't like the unknown. We like certainty. We deal in definites. It's, of course, you can see this in the polarization of our political world at the moment, can't you? We've got two sides, and of course it's playing out today across the Atlantic in America. We've got two sides who are very, very certain of themselves, very certain. And of course that leads to the division in the hatred that we then see arising of that, yeah? And we've become, Dr. McGilchrist believed that we've become very, very left-brained in this regard. So a shrinking away from the unknown, the uncertain, to nuance, to greyness. And we like what we know, we like what's certain, and we like to come to certainty very, very quickly. And of course we do that. So stepping into the journey of the Dharma, the path of the Dharma, is a step into the unknown, and that makes it very, very uncomfortable. We can, as we practice, get a sense of the prison that we've been in, and we'll get this sort of piece by piece. I don't know, for some of you who might have been practicing now for some time, and maybe many of us have been tuning in, we've been practicing meditating for some time, and you might have had this experience of all of a sudden stepping into a situation that would cause craving, or would cause reaction, or cause hate or ill will, and waiting for that to sort of come up, that response to come up, and then it doesn't come up. I don't know if people have experienced this, where it's like you step into a situation where you'd usually be reactive, and you sort of brace for it to start up, for our mind to go to the places that it usually does, and then all of a sudden it doesn't happen, and you go, oh, what a relief, fantastic, what a liberation, what freedom. Even in those small instances of just being able to do and behave in a way that's different from the way that we would have normally, a total liberation, a total freedom. And of course, this is what's possible with the Dharma, to an unimaginable extent. For Vimilakirti, he's saying an unimaginable extent. He's saying, that taste of freedom can be multiplied and multiplied. So we can all have a little taste of this. Sometimes we can have this when we're on retreat as well. I get this very, very strongly if we go on retreat. And particularly on solitary retreat, I can come out of my normal habitual mental states and into something of more freedom, more liberation. And often what happens is I have a period of mourning. A period of mourning for time lost, spent in petty, small, ugly mental states. And I particularly mourn because I know when I go back into the conditions that isn't retreat, I know they will start to come up again. And then I feel them sort of slip away after retreat. Always heartbreaking when it happens. Some of you might have had that similar experience. But we can get that sense sometimes when we're on retreat, of the prison that we sit in so much of the time with the limitations that we put on ourselves. With the muddy mental states, the ugly mental states that we're in, the prison that we're in, and then the taste of liberation that comes when we drop it. So that's very, very important retreat. Very, very important to be able to sort of taste some of that. And of course it grows. The more that we practice, the more that we meditate, the more that we start to develop along this path of the Buddha, it grows. That sense of liberation grows. That sense of freedom that we can get on retreat grows. And there, with that is more love, more connection, more friendliness, and more going forth from status and power and control and all of the things, and certainty and all of the things that we take a refuge in, a false refuge in as well. So that's what Vimilakirti does. He's saying, look, this whole vision, this whole image is open to you, and he's really encouraging us to take that first step on it. So that's what I'd say to you. That's what we're going to explore over the next 6 weeks. We're going to explore that vision of Vimilakirti, that inconceivable emancipation. Yeah, and just for people as well to know, what this series over the next 6 weeks is based on is on Bhante Sangharakshita, the man who founded this movement. He had a lecture series called The Inconceivable Emancipation. You can still get it. I believe it's on Free Buddhist Audio, but you can still get it also. The book is still published, The Inconceivable Emancipation. You can get it from Windhorse.